So now we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Population and Community Ecology. Your book opens up with talking about New England forests and how they come full circle. In 1620, there wasn't many inhabitants of our land or our country. And when it began to become colonized over the next 200 years, settlers came. And the original species of trees were the sugar maple, the American beech, the white pine, the eastern hemlock. And over the next 200 years, settlers deforested that land for farmland. Peaking around 1800, about 80% of those original forests were gone. Between 1850 and 1950, it was realized that there was better farming in the Midwest, and so farms were moved to the Midwest and the farms in New England were abandoned. They began to recover, and goldenrod took over. It cycled with the leaf beetle, so the goldenrod took over, the leaf beetle sort of took over the goldenrod, and that allowed the white pine to come in, which shaded out the goldenrod. Around 1900s, the humans came back and said, we can use this white pine for lumber, and harvested quite a bit of it, which then allowed the American beech and the sugar maple to return. And essentially, the forests that were there before the 1600s have recreated themselves. And so it shows how through this process of succession, how these different populations can change. Nature exists at several levels of complexity. We go from the individual all the way up to the biosphere. We're going to focus a lot on populations in this unit. So this is going to be real important for what we are looking at this go around. When we're looking at population ecology, which is the study of factors that cause populations to increase and decrease, we have to take a look at immigration and births, which are both things. Populations moving in are going to increase population size, and then emigration and deaths are things that are going to decrease population size. We're going to spend quite a bit of time with this chart next chapter because we're going to spend a whole unit just on human population. So population characteristics are broken into a couple different factors. There's 5 different factors that contribute to that. One is population size, which is represented by N. It's the total number of individuals within a defined area at a given time. An example is the California condor. The original range was the southwest U.S., but poaching and poisoning and accidents, actually they flew into power lines, brought population down to 22 birds in 1987. They captured all 22 of those birds and started a breeding program, and as of 2009, there were 300 birds. So population size is something that's important. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area or volume for aquatic at a given time. An example is the density of coyotes in Texas. Is the species rare or is it abundant? Will a population outstrip its food supply? It helps set hunting and fishing limits. So if you're looking at individuals per unit area, you might be able to hunt that organism in one particular area, but not in another particular area. Population distribution, and so we're looking at this diagram that's here. Random distribution, so species are randomly dispersed. Examples are tree species in New England forests. There's no pattern to the location of the individual trees. Uniform distribution. These are Australasian gannets. They are territorial nesting birds, and they define their territory very specifically. So their uniform distribution, all individuals maintain a similar distance from each other. Plants that excrete toxic chemicals will also do something similar to this. And then there's clump distribution. We can see these meerkats hanging out here in a clump and another clump and another clump. Many pairs of eyes are better than one at detecting predators, and it provides extra protection. Other examples of clump distribution are things like fish that are schooling, birds that are flocking, mammals that are herding. Our last 2 population characteristics are population sex ratio. Typically, the ratio of males to females is 50-50, but not true in all cases. Something like fig wasps have 20 females to 1 male. Offspring is usually a function of how many females there are. Another example shown here is the sea turtle. Their sex ratio is dependent on the temperature at which the eggs are incubated. We'll spend some time with that when we talk about endangered species. I'll tell you more about my experiences with this green sea turtle here. And then population age structure. So these diagrams are going to be hugely important during our human population units. But it's a description of how many individuals fit into particular age categories. It helps predict how rapidly a population will grow. So if you have a young population or an older population, that's not going to reproduce as quickly as a middle population. Factors that influence population size. We have density-dependent factors and we have density-independent factors. So density-dependent factors influence an individual's probability of survival and reproduction in a manner that depends on the size of the population. So a small population, we have a small population and scarce food supply. Gauss looked at 2 species of paramecium, and he did an experiment where he fed them a constant amount. So he had these 2 species of paramecium, and he said, okay, I'm going to give them each this certain amount of food, and there was rapid population growth, and then it leveled off. He repeated the same experiment, and this time he gave them double the amount of food, and the population doubled, but it also limited. So the limiting resource was the food. You got to what was called the carrying capacity. That's going to be an important term in this unit, and the symbol is K for carrying capacity. It's the limit to what the environment can support. So, for example, the carrying capacity for plants is often limited by the water, or by nitrogen, or by phosphorus. Those things are limiting resources. Limiting resources for animals are often water and food and nest sites. Density-independent factors have the same effect on if a population will survive. But there are things like tornadoes or hurricanes or floods or fires, volcanoes, climatic events, things that will stop population size, but they're more arbitrary. It's not things like food that they're going to run out of. It's something that's going to happen that's going to cause a die-off in a population. An example is that if a pond that freezes in England that doesn't typically freeze, the herons that feed off of that pond will die because they won't have access to the fish that they normally feed on. Population growth rate breaks into a couple of different types. There's 2 population growth models that we're going to look at, J curves and S curves. The growth rate is the number of offspring an individual can produce in a given time period, minus the deaths of the individual or offspring during that same time period. It has what's known as an intrinsic growth rate, the population's maximum potential for growth, which is represented by a small letter R. So what is that population's potential to grow? The first model that we'll look at is the exponential growth model. It comes with this big fancy equation here that we just sort of need to understand. If we look at this is the future population. This is the population that we're trying to predict. This is the current population, so this N sub O, usually it's a sub O and not an O in parentheses, but this N sub O is the current population, and then we use our natural log E, and R here is the intrinsic growth rate that I just spoke of, and then T is how much time we have. So this equation results in this J-shaped curve. So populations here are not limited by the resources. There's no limit that's stopping it, so this population size will continue to grow and grow and grow. Real populations can grow exponentially initially, but then when they reach their carrying capacity, this isn't a true model. So we move to sort of a better model that combines 2 ideas. It's called logistic growth. So the logistic growth model is a population whose growth is initially exponential. So you can see that here. Initially, we are exponential, but slows as the population approaches the carrying capacity, which is K, that symbol is K, of the environment. It's used to predict populations that are subject to density-dependent constraints, such as food or water or nest sites. So that carrying capacity, when we run out of food, this growth of these organisms begins to slow, or we run out of water, or we run out of nest sites. This model does not account for density-independent factors. It doesn't take into account if a fire comes along, or a hurricane, or a volcano. And it produces what's referred to as this S-shaped curve. And then another variation is of the logistic growth model. Populations don't always level off at the carrying capacity. So they don't always perfectly grow nice and slowly and then level off. They overshoot, which means they become larger than the carrying capacity, which then causes a die-off or a crash in the population. For example, many species mate in the fall or the winter when the food supply is plenty because they're coming off of the summer. And then when the young are born in the spring, that availability does not match the new population size, so it causes this rapid die-off. Examples are things like the snowshoe hare and the lynx, or wolves and moose in Isle Royale, Michigan. And this example in Isle Royale, Michigan is a very, very famous example. We'll go into more of that here. So a lot of them go into predator-prey relationships. So lynx and hare are shown over here, and wolves and moose in Isle Royale are shown over here. Two very famous studies, but the idea is that as the hares, the lynx population peaks 1 to 2 years after the hare population peaks. So lynx population grows, then the hare population declines, and then so do the lynx, which allow the hares to reproduce, and they peak, which then allows the lynx to then follow along and peak as well. This Isle Royale, Michigan, these wolves and moose, in 1981, the wolves declined due to a canine virus that they got, and the moose grew until they ran out of food. And then eventually when the wolves sort of overcame this virus, they started to come back, and so now we have a little bit more stable population between the wolves and the moose. We have two different reproductive strategies. We have K-selected species and R-selected species. A K-selected species has a low intrinsic growth rate, which causes populations to increase slowly until they reach their carrying capacity. They reach that K value. Traits of K-selected species, they are typically large. They have a late reproductive age. They have few and large offspring, and they require lots of parental care. These are lots of mammals and most birds. R-selected species have high intrinsic growth rates because they reproduce often and they produce large numbers of offspring. They have rapid population growth followed by overshoots and die-offs. Traits of them include they are typically small, early reproduction age, and then little or no parental care. Examples of these are mosquitoes and dandelions, but also house mice, small fish, insects, and other weeds. How are the following traits significant to R and K-selected species? Well, K-selected species have long lifespans. It takes a long time until they reproduce. They have a few reproductive events. They have few offsprings. Their offspring are large. The parental care is present. The population growth rate is slow, and they are density dependent. The population dynamics, they are stable near the carrying capacity, so they'll grow slow enough to reach that. R-selected species have a short lifespan. They have a short time to reproductive maturity. They have many reproductive events. They produce a lot of offspring. Their offspring are small. They don't care for their offspring. They have fast population growth. They are typically density independent, and their population dynamics are highly variable. And then looking at survivorship curves, if we look at our three different types, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 here, these are typically our K-selected species, elephants, whales, humans. They have a high survival for most of their lifespans. And then we have type 3 down here, which is typically our R-selected. These are our mosquitoes and dandelions. They have low survivorship early, and then few reach adulthood. Okay. And then we have type 2, where a whole bunch of species fall in the middle. These are our coral and squirrels. They have a constant decline in survivorship throughout their lifespan.